Hey everybody from around the world, welcome to another Microsoft Virtual Academy training course.
Yes.
We're going to go ahead and get started with this training course. This one is on building blocks. And I know that doesn't mean much to you yet, but we're going to explain it.
Yeah, hopefully it will soon.
Yeah, hopefully it'll mean a lot to you real soon. Excellent. So let's go ahead and go forward with introductions.
Yeah, we got a fair amount of material.
We got a lot of material.
Yes.
Yeah. We'll try not to move too quickly though, but it will be recorded, so you can always go back and watch it in like 0.8x mode.
Right, exactly.
You can really slow down, understand Christopher's words. Or you can watch it in 1.2 if you can really keep up.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so without further ado, my name is Jeremy Foster. I've been on MVAs before, so maybe we've met already. Good to see you again. I go by Code Foster online, so you can find me if you want to find me online after the event. I'm at codefoster.com where I do some blogging, and I'm also on Twitter at CodeFoster. I am a developer evangelist at Microsoft. I've been here for a couple years, having a really good time with it. And I always say that the only thing I like more than writing code is talking about writing code. So that's why I do it. That's me. And now, Christopher.
Hey, so I am Christopher Harrison. I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer, head geek at Geek Trainer Incorporated. I've been doing technology since my father brought home a VIC-20 back many years ago. Sort of just kicked off my love, and ever since then I've been spending an awful lot of time training, doing a fair bit of code, mostly these days on the SharePoint and an MVC side of things, and also a fair bit of SQL as well, just kind of mixed in there for a bit of color. Now, as far as what we're going to be doing over the next 3 sessions here, over the next 3 days, try to describe exactly what building blocks is all about. This is day one, initialize, and really our goal with day one here is to go in and take a look at both C# and JavaScript. That maybe you've been heads down on C#, been trying to figure out what this whole JavaScript thing is all about. Why should I be interested? What do I need to know? Maybe you've been doing an awful lot of JavaScript, HTML, and you're taking a look at maybe getting into the server side or maybe getting into XAML C#, and so you want to see what you're going to need to know in that aspect. So in a lot of ways, today's going to be a compare and contrast. Hey, this is how you do things in C#. Hey, here's how you do things in JavaScript. Give you an opportunity to see both worlds and hopefully fill in some gaps and learn a fair bit along the way.
And then the next couple of days, what we're going to be doing is we're calling day 2 construct, and then day 3 is called extend. And basically, like Christopher mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the code. So C# and JavaScript going to kind of remain cross-platform and platform agnostic. So we're not going to be talking about any specific UI platform that you might instantiate this code into, but just talking about the code itself, which is always really fun. Now, day 2, construct, we're going to be getting into the UI, and we're going to be kind of focusing on a Windows 8 environment, although a lot of the design concepts are going to still be agnostic and hopefully kind of globally applicable, hopefully. And then finally, we're going to be extending the platform on day 3. And what we're doing there is we're going to talk about some of the back-end stuff that you can do to support your app or apps in a cross-platform manner. And we're going to be talking a lot about Azure Azure Mobile Services on day 3.
Yep.
So a lot of good content there.
Absolutely. But let's focus in on day 1, since that's, after all, what we're here to deliver. And again, like I mentioned before, what we're going to be taking a look at is the essentials of C# and JavaScript. So if you are going to sit down and start to kind of flesh out some form of an application, what are you going to need to know to get started? Where's a good jump-off point? And that's really what we want to try and accomplish. That we are going to take a look at these 2 great languages side by side, compare and contrast, show off how you're going to do things in one environment versus the next.
What we're hoping is that the folks that have the C# experience are going to be able to do some mapping and say, okay, that's what I use in C#, that's how you do it in JavaScript, and learn a little bit by that. Exactly,
yeah. So as a result, this is not going to be a deep dive into either of those environments, if for no other reason than just simply the fact that we've only got about 6-7 hours here, and that would take a bit more time, even just to cover one of these, let alone both of these. And then finally, as Jeremy mentioned, this is going to be platform agnostic. So we're not going to focus in on Windows app. We're not going to focus in on MVC. That unless there's something that's appropriate for that particular environment, the real goal here is focused in on the language and not necessarily, hey, this is how you're going to go in and set up an event handler. This is how you're going to create a controller, say, for example, in MVC. Unless that really is critical to what it is we're trying to talk about, we're really going to focus in just on the language. Now, with that in mind, our expectations, sort of what it is that we're targeting this at, and it really is anybody that has a building enthusiasm. We see what we did there? Clever. But anyway, with a building enthusiasm around everything that's going to be just tossed right at you next week if you're going to be attending Build, maybe watching some of the different sessions online. We're going to be targeting this at beginner to intermediate developers. So some of this very well may be review. In fact, in this first module, we really are going to start almost with hello world, that we are going to start with, hey, this is how you declare a variable. This is how you reference things. And I know for some of you, you're going to be thinking, oh, well, that's a lot of review. That's very low level. Well, part of that's the target audience, but part of that's also because it's very different how you do even sometimes those simple things in C# or in JavaScript. So we want to make sure that we get everybody on the same page as we continue to build forward. We are looking towards young developers, looking to grasp concepts, kind of get a handle on things, and developers that are looking to go off and start doing things with XAML, C#, HTML5, and JavaScript. So really, as a result, the prerequisites, if you've done a hello world in C#, if you've done a hello world in JavaScript, maybe you've been doing one side or the other for quite a while and just looking to investigate the other side, that's about the only prerequisite, that there isn't anything to go off and necessarily sit down and take a look at before viewing our session.
If you have any trouble with the hello world applications, just start simple and go with a hello application. Start there.
Yep. Work
into hello world. You can get there. That's kind of your next step.
Yes, exactly. All right. Now, for those of you that are not already in the MVA community, haven't already checked it out, this is free online training for IT pros, developers, and really runs the whole gamut of different possibilities, different technologies that are out there by Microsoft. Over 1 million different registered users, up-to-date, great information that's available. And of course, the Earn While You Learn, you get 50 points for watching this event. Head on over to the URL that you see down at the very bottom, and then you'll notice the little code BLDGBLKS1 is going to be the code that you're going to punch into there, and that will expire on April 26th of 2014. So just to clarify, April 26th. Of 2014, not the 26th month.
There you go.
Yes.
That'd be tough.
It would be a little bit tough.
Okay, so are we ready to break down what we're going to be doing today?
Let's get into it.
Let's look at the agenda. Okay, so here's what we're going to be doing this day one, the initialize day. As far as modules go, we're going to have 6 modules, each of them roughly an hour. And the first one, the one we're going to break into right now, is basic syntax. That's just what we've called it because we want to encapsulate, we want to capture all of these kind of simple JavaScript and C# concepts in the basic syntax of the language. And then module 2, we're going to be talking about lists in C# and the analogous array in JavaScript. Mm-hmm. Module 3, asynchroncy and concurrency, very hot topics these days, pretty much essential.
Yes, yeah, you really do have to know this.
Gonna have to have it.
Yep.
Module 4, we're going to be talking about data storage. So some cool concepts inside of how do you get stuff to persist so it's there for the next time. Module 5, services and OData, where you need to talk to the cloud. You need to go out there and pull stuff down. People are expecting it. If your app is a silo, it's not going to be very exciting.
No, so, not going to get very far.
Yeah, and also, if you're relying only on your own code, you're going to be limited intrinsically. So we want to bring in code that other people wrote. We want to bring in third-party libraries. So we're going to talk about that in Module 6.
Absolutely.
So that's the agenda, and let's go ahead and get started with Module 1, the basic syntax. Here we go. Now, for basic syntax, here's how we're going to break it down. The following topics we're going to cover in the next hour. So as you can tell, we've already cut into that hour just a little bit, so we don't have a whole lot of time to cover quite a wide swath of concepts here. So I'll speak quicker. References, variables, conditionals, loops, functions, classes, and inheritance. All these concepts in programming languages exist whether you're using C# or JavaScript. You really want to figure out how your language of choice does this. And you want to have the concepts because you want to be at least somewhat of a polyglot. You can't just, you can, but you shouldn't just type yourself to one language and stick there entirely. It's really good to understand those concepts across. So.
Yeah. Because if you're not doing one side or the other today, you will be tomorrow.
Oh, how many C# developers doing MVC? You find yourself on the client, and all of a sudden you're like, I've got to write some JavaScript.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the good old days, especially, you brought up MVC, something near and dear to my heart. The days of web forms I can drag and drop out and really avoid having to write any client-side code. Those days are really now gone, that you will have to go in and write client-side code. So if you've been putting off learning JavaScript, you're not going to be able to for much longer.
Yep. Okay, so let's start with references. References is really simple. We're just bringing in code into our project, bringing in libraries that we wrote somewhere else, bringing in libraries that other people have written, and we're going to look at how to do that first in JavaScript and then in C#. So hopefully you learned something here.
Yep.
Now, the JavaScript engine that's running, whenever your app, wherever it is, whatever it is, it's running in a JavaScript engine, and that engine is running a certain amount of script, and it gets that script by what I'm calling inclusion. You have to include these scripts in order for them to run, and they're executed in order, so it really matters in JavaScript what order these scripts have been brought in, because they are executed in order. Now, you don't usually include the script references in the JavaScript, you include it in the HTML. So we'll take just a glance at that real quick. However, this can become unwieldy, and so there are ways, require.js being by far the most dominant of those ways, to handle these dependencies, these third-party libraries or your own libraries, in the JavaScript itself and in a more logical way, so that you can conditionally bring things in and you can bring things in at runtime.
Yep.
But the classic way to bring JavaScript into your app is through the HTML file where your JavaScript is actually showing up. So you've got yourself an HTML file, maybe it's called page.html, and you've got some little lines on the top that say, bring in script 1, script 2, script 3, and then here's my HTML.
Yep.
So nice and simple, and this is what that might look like. You've got an HTML page. Hopefully you recognize this. If not, study it. Go to msdn.com and look up Introduction to HTML. That's important. And look at the script references in the header. Notice that I've included script 1, script 2, script 3. Those are I've set those as the source of those script tags. Notice also that I'm bringing in another library that's not in my own project. I'm bringing in jQuery from somewhere else on the web. This is a really powerful concept in JavaScript, the ability to source things that aren't even hosted on your computer or in your application.
Absolutely. That's a huge thing, especially if you're going to be doing, again, going back to web apps, and I promise this will be the last time since we said platform agnostic. But one of the very simple concepts of anything at all that's going to be web hosted is you really want to try and avoid round trip sending down data. If we can let somebody else host the scripts and let them pull it down from their servers, that's going to help improve the performance of our applications and also just help us keep current in the JavaScript libraries that we're going to be using.
Yeah, and the fact that if a person has a reference in an app that you wrote on their computer, and it's going to the CDN, and it's a common CDN, then when they use another app on their computer, that same file, even though it's a different app on their computer or a different website, doesn't have to be re-downloaded.
Exactly.
So that's pretty cool.
That's a huge thing.
Yeah, CDNs are great. Notice also on this slide that I've brought in some of my own script to run right on this page. Now, this is possible, but it's probably what we'll see later in a session tomorrow is probably called an anti-pattern. You probably don't usually want to run script in the page ad hoc. It might be a code smell. It might mean that you don't have the best architecture, because usually you want those scripts to be external in a script file and then brought in with an import.
Yep.
Now, I mentioned require.js and how you bring things in the JavaScript. So what you're looking at now is JavaScript, not the HTML. When you use require.js, you end up with a single script reference in your HTML, and that is the script reference to require.js. From then on, you can do all of your dependencies with JavaScript. So in your JavaScript, you can say, for this block of script, I'm interested in loading this script. And then inside your block, you have reference to that script because Require.js is smart enough to load that for you.
And that'll make things a lot cleaner, a lot easier.
Yeah. Much better architecture.
Yep. Okay, so on the C# side of things, we're not dealing with just simply files, but rather we actually have full compiled code, and that's what we're going to need to reference. Or to go one step up, if we're going to use anything inside of C#, I like to say there's always two very basic steps. Step one is to reference the assembly that code happens to exist in, and then step two is to reference the class. So to focus in right now on step one, this is going to be our reference. Now, our references, our objects, our assemblies is our compiled code. And put simply for our conversation, an assembly is either a DLL or an executable. An executable, something, of course, you could just simply double-click on and it will launch. That could be a Windows app. That could be a command line app. Or it could be a DLL, a library that I could use in a lot of other applications, say MVC apps, there we go again, say a Windows app, or really anything else that you might be building. Now, in order to add in an assembly, there's really two ways that we can do this. One way is to add a reference directly to that DLL. And this is accomplished just by right-clicking, saying Add Reference, and then choosing the reference from here. And you'll notice that I could just go in, put a little check mark next to the particular item. I could go in and do a browse if I so desired. Now, the other way to actually bring in code is by utilizing a Nougat package that Jeremy hinted earlier at different libraries. And there's a good friend of mine that likes to say we're not launching rockets here. And the point that he's trying to make when he says that is whatever it is that we're trying to do, chances are somebody else has already gone out and done it. And these days they've been kind enough to put something up on a Codeplex, write a blog about it. So let's take advantage of code that's already out there. And this is where Nougat really shines, is because this is going to give us access to code that both Microsoft has written as well as other third parties that's going to help make our lives easier in the long run. And so Nougat is going to be both potentially private, but also public. So I can pull this down from a public Nougat library and access different DLLs and so forth that way. And the great advantage to using Nougat as opposed to referencing a DLL is that a Nougat package can do more than just simply add the DLL reference. So for example, it might be able to update your config file, maybe give you a README file on what it is that you need to do next to further configure things, etc. And this is also going to be very easy. Just simply right-click on the project, go to Manage Nougat Packages, and then from there, choose the particular Nougat package that you might want. And in fact, we'll actually be going in and seeing a few of these a little bit later. In fact, there's two right there on my screen, the JSON.NET and the Entity Framework. Both of those we'll actually see a little bit later today. Now, the second part is referencing a class. Now, one of the big things to keep in mind about classes in .NET is that not only are they physically inside of assemblies, they're logically grouped together into namespaces. And so we need to make sure that we reference both the namespace as well as the class. And we can do this by either utilizing a using statement, which you see right up towards the very top here. And then when I go to reference the particular class in question, just simply use the name of the class that I might want. Or I could do the exact same thing by typing out the full name here. And you'll notice that this first part up here, that system.txt, that's our logical namespace. And then string builder is the name of the class. Now, the big thing that I want to highlight about this is, well, first of all, A, this code wouldn't compile because you'll notice that I reused the same variable, but also B, that this is going to produce the exact same compiled code. So there is no performance difference whatsoever in utilizing the using statement to bring in the namespace or to utilize the class name with the full namespace name in front of it. So it's going to compile the exact same way, no performance difference whatsoever between those two. So now that we've seen how we can go off and get code, let's go ahead and take a look at how we're going to declare our different objects and utilize our variables. Now, with our variables, the biggest thing that I want you to notice is that C# is going to be strongly typed, meaning that when you say that a variable is of a particular type, that's going to be the type for that variable forever. That you're not going to be able to change that. I'm not going to be able to assign something else into it. So if I say that I want x to be an integer, and I try to set x equal to be the string wibble, that's going to fail to compile. It's not going to work. C# is strongly typed. Now, the types break down into two very basic high-end concepts of value types and reference types. Our value types are things like booleans, enums, and say integers. And then our reference types are going to be our strings, arrays, and then classes or objects that you create on your own. And there is a lot of difference between them, but again, trying to keep this relatively high level, I'm just going to leave that conversation for right there. Now, another very big concept in both JavaScript as well as in C# is scoping of our variables. That you're going to notice that basically everything inside of both of these languages is contained inside of curly braces. And in C#, curly braces will set scope for a variable. So you'll notice that I've declared output right up here, and I did that inside that first curly brace. So it's going to be available to me. It's going to be said to be in scope until we get to that closing curly brace. On the flip side, however, let me just choose a different color. I did length right here. Length, you're going to notice, is going to be declared inside of that set of curly braces. And so as a result, once we get to the that first set of curly braces, the one that I have highlighted in blue, length is now going to go out of scope, be no longer available to us. Now, you're going to notice that when we go to declare a variable, there's a couple of different ways that, that we can do this. One way is by indicating the data type right up front and then creating the object just like that. If we're dealing with an array, you're going to notice that arrays in C# are going to use that little square bracket right there. And then I could actually set the different variables that I might want, or the values that I might want, by just simply putting it inside of a curly brace list. And then you're also going to notice that I can instantiate objects by creating a new instance of whatever it is that I might want. And then you'll notice right here, setting the different properties to, whoops, let me choose a better color there. There we go. Setting the different properties right there. Now, properties is something that we'll actually get into a little bit later on. But the big thing that I want you to highlight is that I'm able to store a first name and a last name on this little thing called member. Now, there's also going to be times when maybe we don't want to sit down and build that up front. That in order for this little block of code right here to work, the one that I'm now circling, in order for that to work, we would need to have created that in advance. Well, there's going to be times when maybe we just want to create something on the fly. And that's what we can do with this bottom one right here, which is our anonymous type. And with an anonymous type, I'm going to just set that right up on the fly and just say, hey, I want you to have a first name and a last name. You're also going to notice that little keyword var here. And I want to pause for just a moment and highlight var for two groups of people. For my VB6 people and for my JavaScript people. Because this means something different in both of those environments. That for those of you that remember the good old days of VB6, and every now and then I still run into people that are still doing projects with VB6. var, variant, that's not what this is. This is strongly typed. And then one of the big things that Jeremy will be talking about a little bit later when we get into JavaScript is the concept of var and being able to use that to declare variables. In that environment, you're going to notice that that's not going to declare the type. This is still strongly typed, even though I'm using var, because what it's going to do is it's going to figure out the type based on whatever I set the value to. So I could have, for example, with member here, I could have said, sort of looks like a 4-year-old grabbed a crayon there, I could have said var, and then member equals new member, and it would set up the data type of that little member variable as member. So even though I'm using var, it's still strongly typed. always keep that in mind, that in C#, it's always going to be strongly typed.
So in other words, it would be meaningless to do var member without instantiating it at the same time because it doesn't know what kind of thing it's putting in there.
That's exactly it. Yeah, and in fact, you'd get a compiler error that if you just simply said var member and did not set that to a value, it's going to not compile at that point.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right.
You know, I got to tell you, Jeremy, we've been talking for a long time, and I'd like to see some code. Wouldn't you like to see some code?
Absolutely.
All right, let's get in. Let's see some code here. So let me get out of my slide here, and let me get over to Visual Studio, and let me open up my little program here. Okay, so here's what I want to do. That if I want to, again, declare a variable, I can do that very simply by indicating the data type, giving it a name. So let's say answer. And I can set that equal to 42. And now we've got that available to us from that set of curly braces on down. But the big thing that I really want to focus my attention in on is on declaring my anonymous types. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say var Christopher equals new. And then in curly braces, I'm going to say, well, I want a property on there. I want a piece of data on there. And I want to call that piece of data first name. And then let's set that equal to Christopher. There we go. And then we'll go ahead and say last name. And we'll set that equal to Foster. There we go. And let's go ahead and say var Jeremy and equals new. And by the way, while I'm typing, one thing that's worth mentioning about both JavaScript and C#, because I always get asked this about case sensitivity, both of these languages are case sensitive. And you are going to notice that all keywords, by the way, my last name is going to be Harrison today. There we go, rather than Foster. But in any event, what I want you to notice here is that in this environment, both of these are going to be case sensitive. So both C# and JavaScript, case sensitive. Both of those environments are case sensitive. So let's go ahead and write out real quick. Let's go ahead and say write line, and let's say Christopher, first name. And I see that I have another typo there. I'll go back and fix that later.
So they're case sensitive, but they're not spelling sensitive.
Correct. As a developer, you don't have to spell correctly. You just have to spell consistently.
Gotcha.
Yep. Okay. All right, and let's go ahead and print that out. And you know what? Let me go ahead and just use the refactor because it's going to bug me anyway. Christopher. There we go. See, I do know how to spell my own name. All right, cool. So now let me go ahead and launch this. A little Control F5, and you're going to notice, sure enough, that we get the little press the any key to continue, and then up top we get Jeremy and Christopher. The one little thing that I want to highlight about all of this behind the scenes is this. Let me go to my output and let me just grab this. Whoops. Try that again. There we go. Copy and get out of full screen. And I want this and IDLEAZUM. And let me go ahead and do a paste. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm firing up a little tool called IDLEAZUM, or Intermediate Language Disassembler. And this gives you the opportunity to take a look at what's going on behind the scenes in your code and actually see how it's compiling. And what I want you to notice here is not so much the exact syntax and everything that's going on, but rather, do me a favor, turn off my screen for 2 seconds. Thank you. I just realized I don't have Zoom it launched. See, we're really cooking on this show. There we go. Okay, now you can come back to me. There we go. I just wanted to go get Zoom it. So what I want you to notice is that right here, it created that little anonymous type for me, and it set it up with that first name and with that last name automatically for me. Now, if you remember, we actually used this twice. That you'll notice that we had both Christopher as well as Jeremy. So we used the exact same thing twice. It was smart enough to realize, hey, wait a minute, you've got two properties, both of type string. You called them the exact same thing. There's no reason for me to go in and create a brand new type based on that. I can reuse the exact same one. So even though it's doing this at compile time, even though we're not giving it a name, it's still able to reuse that code. So how do things work in JavaScript?
A little bit differently.
Okay.
It's a little bit different. We should take a look.
Yeah, why don't you show me?
So in JavaScript, obviously we have the concept of variables still. We must be able to take our data, our temporary data or whatever, and put it somewhere in memory so that we can work with it, transform it, move it, whatever it is. Now, in JavaScript, we don't have a robust type system to work with, and that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's just a different environment, okay? We do have what are called primitives. So the primitive types in JavaScript are this funny one called undefined that I know doesn't exist in C#, and it's kind of lower level than null. It's not even there to be called null. It's undefined. So we have undefined, null, Booleans, that's true or false, that's a primitive type. Numbers and strings, those are primitive types. Everything else is an object, okay? And technically it's an object or an array or a function. So let's just look at a few variable declarations and instantiations here and use this as some talking points. So what we are looking at is 6 lines that all begin with var. So we're declaring a lot of variables here, and they all start with var, which looks exactly like what Christopher just showed. But in JavaScript, it just means this is a variable.
It's very different.
And it doesn't care what that type is.
Right.
And in fact, it's not even consistent necessarily about what that type is in the scope of your program. I could, on line 1, say var a equals 1, and then later on in my program, I could say a equals wibble. A string. I could pack a string right into a variable that was otherwise declared or instantiated with a number. Okay, so there's not a type system tied onto these things. So you can see that in A, I'm going to have what is going to be translated as a number. In B, I'm going to have what's going to be translated as a string. Now, what's that on C? If you're not familiar with this is very similar to what Christopher just showed. It's an anonymous type.
Yep.
Just put the keyword new in front of that first curly brace here, and you'd have the anonymous type in C#. Mm-hmm. So we're creating actually what looks like the exact same type, a type with a first name and a last name. You notice the difference with my my variable names there? I've got a lowercase f. What's the deal with that?
That's a good question, and that's I'm thinking of some form of a camel or something.
Yeah, it's humps, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yep.
we're seeing humps.
Yep.
Yeah, what we're talking about here is camel case.
Yeah.
Which is the default convention in JavaScript.
Right.
It ends up being one of the more visible convention differences between your C# and your JavaScript. It's really good to adhere to this standard because that's the way JavaScript is written. That's the way you're going to find the forum posts and the questions and answers and everything.
And then bring that back into C# and .NET. Convention in C# .NET is to do Pascal casing. That if we just kick to my screen for 2 seconds here, whoops. Let me bring up the right copy of Visual Studio. That's the one that I want. There we go. Now we're all set. You're going to notice here that I did a capital F for first name. And again, that's the convention in C#, Pascal casing.
Yeah. All right, so then the curly braces on the outside here actually indicate that this is an object, and that's all you really need to create an object. So you don't need to declare the object. You don't need to create the class or anything like that. You just make an object by wrapping some curly braces around there. Var D, I'm packing in there a array. So arrays are signified with square braces.
Yep.
So it's a pretty terse syntax. Objects, curly braces, arrays, square braces. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of get into combining those. Let's look at var F. Var F has square braces, and inside of there I've got 3 things that have curly braces. So with D, E, and F, you can see that I'm creating 3 different arrays, but in one of those arrays I'm putting numbers. Mm-hmm. In another array, I'm putting strings, and in the other array, I'm putting objects.
Yep.
So it's very versatile. There's a lot of flexibility with JavaScript. It'll end up really thrilling you and really frustrating you. I can guarantee that JavaScript is the language that's most loved and most hated by developers.
Yeah, I without a doubt, I would agree with that completely. Yep.
All right, now I want to introduce you to a site that I use a lot, just because I'm going to be using this a little bit in the scope of the course, and this is CodePen. CodePen is a bit like JS Fiddle, if you've used that one. CodePen allows us to write a little bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and kind of do it all on the fly here. So you're going to see me using this a bit today. I'm going to go ahead and write myself out a little bit of HTML. There's a div, and then in my JavaScript, I can actually just refer to that div and set its inner text value or something to something whatever I want. Let's use Wibble. And you'll see that the word wibble will just appear on the bottom here, and I can actually add some styles to this as well. So let's go ahead and turn that font size up a bit. And
that's a little
this
bit.
This becomes a really good kind of on the fly, just right out of the holster way of writing a little bit of code. So this is the means that I'm going to use to show you guys some things.
I love it.
And so let's look at a couple of JavaScript-y things in CodePen. Okay. Let's go ahead and create for ourselves. Actually, I saved a CodePen and made a link to it here. So how do I get back to my out of my pen mode? There we go. I just colored my arrow. So I jumped directly to a CodePen that I wrote earlier, where I basically have these variables that I was showing you before. And I want to show you a couple of interesting things about these. Here I'm just putting a 1 in there, and you see that 1 is on my screen in my output here. And on this display, I think it'd be better to turn this down just a little bit so that I can fit more. Now we've got 1, and it's outputting a 1. 2, and it's outputting a 2. Now notice that in the case of the 1, it did automatically do that type conversion there. It put an integer into the inner text of my div down there, which means that it converted it from an integer to a string. And JavaScript, just like it kind of handles these types dynamically, it also handles all the conversion dynamically and automatically. So let's look at the third example here, which I believe I do down lower. A plus B. Now remember that A is 1, the number, and B is 2, the string. And when I do A plus B, look at what I get. Looks like 12.
Yeah.
It's actually 1, 2, because it's taken that 1, turned it into a string, and concatenated that to the 2, which was a string. If I want to do some coercion myself, then I need to use a function like parseInt, and I can do that where necessary.
And that's why the third one came out as a 3 there, because you converted that 2 into an integer.
Absolutely. Yep. I turned the 2 into an integer. 1 plus 2, as I hope most of us know, is in fact 3.
Generally speaking.
Yeah, generally speaking. Now, I've got a number of other examples in here, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave those. But every time I'm in CodePen here, you guys can glance up at the top of my screen. All of my CodePens are going to be at CodePen.io, CodeFoster, Pen, and then there's going to be a little 5-character code there, in this case MNDLG. If you just go there, you're looking at the exact same pen I am. So you guys can go and look at any of my demos by just glancing at those pens. But let's go ahead and move on. Let's move on from variables to conditionals. And conditionals, we're going to start in JavaScript. Conditionals, quite simple, so I'm not going to spend too much time here.
Right, yeah, because really every language has a concept of conditionals.
It really does. And in JavaScript and C#, they look a lot the same.
Yeah,
there's one major difference that I am going to bring into OpenAir.
Have at it.
Yeah, if you're a baby developer, what we're talking about here is testing some value. And if that value is true, branching, doing one thing, versus if the value is not true, doing something else. It's an absolute staple in software development. There's so many times when you need to ask a question like, is the user currently logged in? If so, I need to do something very different than if the user is not logged in and they're anonymous to me.
Right. Yep.
Absolutely. So that's the concept. I think that most of you guys have that. The one thing that I really want to highlight as a difference here, and again, I've got myself a CodePen, so I'll jump to that and you guys can look at that code in the top. The one thing I want to bring out about the difference between C# and JavaScript. In JavaScript, we have these values that we call false-ish, kind of false.
Sort of, but not really.
Sort of, but not really. And what I'm talking about here is the fact that if I say x equals true, that's explicit, right? X is true.
Yep.
If I say x equals false, that's also explicit. I'm setting this to a Boolean, so x is now false. It's easy to evaluate that. But what if I set x to no or yes as a string? How's it going to act then? How does it know how to act? Well, in C#, it'll say, can't do that. This is a string. This is a Boolean, and never the twain shall meet, right?
Right.
In JavaScript, it says, sure, that's fine. Strings, they're welcome to become Booleans, but I'll warn you, every single string is evaluated as true. So that's a little bit weird. You got to know that so it doesn't bite you, right?
Yes.
Even if I say x equals no, that's true. If I say x equals 1, and I need to take off my quotes, that's true. Now, if I say x equals 0, 0 is a falsy value. 0 means or implies false. So if you have a value that ends up being 0, that is translated as false. If 0 evaluates to false. So the other thing that is falsy is null. If you have a value that's null, that evaluates to false. So what you end up seeing a lot of times is somebody declaring some variable, and then maybe they're initializing it to null, or maybe not. Maybe they're just setting it equal to something that got passed in, parameter 1, whatever. But we don't know at this point if this was actually passed in, if it's null, or if it's actually a value. So you'll see people do things like this in JavaScript a lot. If v.
Yep.
This is just a null check. There's the easy way to do this in C# as well, but it's more explicit. In JavaScript, we just say if v. If it's null, this won't happen. If it's non-null, this will occur.
Yep.
So let's go ahead and move on to C# variable, or C# conditionals, rather.
Sure. On the C# side of things, the biggest thing that you're going to notice is, number one, that the syntax is identical. Really you're going to notice that it's going to be if, our condition in parentheses, and away we go from there. The couple of real quick things that I want to highlight here, number one is you are going to notice as the curly braces are optional. So if you have just a single line, you can get away with without that. If you do have multiple lines, then you can go ahead and put that in, and then you'll also notice, of course, that you have your else statements. The biggest thing to highlight, and let me switch over to Visual Studio here real quick. The biggest thing to highlight about how C# is going to make things happen, if I open up my conditional demos, there we go, is you're going to notice that little double equals. Now, with it as double equals, you're going to notice that this will work. You're going to notice that I set 42. You're going to notice you've chosen the answer. That's what I'm going to print out. And if I come back over here, and let me just comment that out real quick. By the way, I'll take 2 seconds here. Control-K, Control-U to uncomment. Control-K, Control-C to comment. So, which I just love. And so now let me just go ahead and say conditional demos run. And if I run this, you're going to notice it tells me I've chosen the answer. Because again, I've got 42 in there. Now, let's say that I was typing this out real quick, and this has happened to me a million times. If x equals 42.
That's a problem.
That's a problem. You're going to notice that if I try to do this, this is not going to build. It's going to give me an error message saying, hey, we cannot convert an integer to a Boolean. In JavaScript, what it would actually do is it would go ahead and run that first, put 42 into x, and then look to see whether or not x had a value. And if it did, it would test as true. And so then you're just tearing your hair out trying to figure out what in the world is going on there. And the answer is you forgot that single equals. So not having that implicit conversion to Boolean does make things a lot easier. So not quite as flexible. That if you want to check to see if something is null, you do have to explicitly type in equal to null. But what's really nice is that it does help to avoid those little problems when all you were really missing was an equal sign. Okay, so let me get back into my slides here.
And you know what? Before you continue, I should point out one other significant difference, and that is the presence of a triple equal sign in JavaScript.
Yes.
Has that bitten you before?
It has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the triple equal sign in JavaScript has a significant meaning other than the double equal sign. So we won't take the time to go into it, but definitely look that one up.
Yeah, it's going to do a type check as well. Yeah. Yep. Perfect. Okay. Well, now that we've done our conditionals, let's see about doing something over and over again. You know, being repetitive, repetitious, redundant.
Reiterative, if you will.
There we go. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just going to keep hitting this joke until somebody laughs. There we go.
Our camera guy has laughed.
Excellent.
So please move
on.
on.
All right. Okay, moving on. Please don't tell that joke again. All right. Here's all of our loops. And again, if you've done programming in the past, all of these are going to be very familiar to you. The biggest thing, of course, to highlight with any of these loops is that with the while and the do loop, you're responsible for making sure that the condition changes. with the for and the for each, it will handle that for you. That on the for side, you're going to indicate that I want my little counter to be incremented right there. The for each, it basically is just going to do each one of those one at a time. So if I have 10 scores inside of there, then it will run that for each 10 times and put that variable as to each score. So if I've got my little set, so we go through each one, it's going to grab the first one and then grab the second one and then grab the third one and then set that to be whatever variable it is that I've declared, which in my case is score. And again, 4-year-old and a crayon there. Okay, so if I kick back over to Visual Studio here, and let me get out of full screen. There we go. Let me open up my loop demos. And the big thing that I want you to notice about my loop demos, I'm not going to worry too much about printing all of this out. All of this code will be available. The biggest thing that I want you to know is that each block is identical. Each block does the exact same thing. So in each spot, what we're going to do is we're going to declare some form of an index in my case. And by the way, if I can take 2 seconds, it's time to get away from doing single letter variables. Please, no more while I is less than 10, no more for loops and declaring j as your variable. Please, type it out. Declare what that variable is. Okay, I'm done. I'm going to put my soapbox away. I'm okay now. Center. All right, now, moving on. Jeremy's just staring at me now.
This might come to fisticuffs after the show.
Every developer has their own little styles, yes. But in any event, let's not even get into a conversation about where curly braces go. But in any event, the big thing that I want you to notice here is that in each spot, what I did inside of each loop was I declared a variable that I called number, and then I grabbed the value from there and then printed out. And I did the exact same thing in each one of those. And while I'm here, it's also worth highlighting real quickly that you'll notice that I was able to keep using the exact same variable there of number. And the reason for that is because, again, in C#, that curly brace is going to end that scope of number, so I could reuse it later on. In JavaScript, that's not going to be the case. That in JavaScript, if I have a while loop and I declare something inside of there, it's still in scope when you get to that closing curly brace. Okay. Now, let me just go back into my program just to kind of prove that this works. We'll go with loop demos, and we'll go ahead and Control F5, and sure enough, everything prints out just as we expected. And again, you notice the exact same results each. So how about in JavaScript?
Once again, it's different.
Okay, of course. We're starting to notice a pattern here.
Yeah, there's a pattern here. C# and JavaScript certainly are different. Oops, I'm in the wrong section. So in JavaScript, I'm going to actually jump you out to a CodePen again, and I'm going to show you, first of all, an example of a loop, and then I'm going to tell you what the subtle differences are between loops in C# and Java. So I've got a kind of a fun example here. If you look at my HTML, you'll see that I have a couple of range input controls, which are these sliders that you see here. And I have a couple of those, and then I've got a div called box with a number of divs inside of it. Okay. And I've got some styling going on that turns on this. It's going to turn these boxes into or the container for these boxes into a flex control. Okay. And then I'm going to wrap that. So it's the CSS is going to handle this wrapping for me automatically and make those things gray and whatever. But the real meat here is in the JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse the CSS and the HTML for now. And let's look at this JavaScript. What I'm actually doing is I'm responding to this box size slider. And when I change the box size, I just go in and I change the size of each and every one of those boxes. So I can change this slider, and I actually, my UI responds by changing the size of those boxes dynamically. So I can make them huge, or I can make them really, really small. Okay. And then the second thing that I capture is the changing of the box count slider. And in that one, now what I'm going to do is whenever the count changes, I'm going to do a for loop here. I'm going to loop through this box count. I'm going to loop a number of times, a certain number of times, and that is the value of my box count slider. So how many did I specify I'd like to loop? Maybe it's 42 or maybe it's 10, whatever. And for each of those values in that loop, I'm going to go do something. I'm going to go to my DOM, and I'm going to create a div element and put it inside that box. So I created this UI, but this is just one application of a loop. I created this UI by doing something inside of a loop. And this for loop runs every single time, and you can see that it's obviously still very performant. Loops are a fundamental element of the language, and so they're going to be very performant.
Yep.
So let's look at the differences, and actually I don't have a slide on it, so I'll just mention the differences between looping in C# and JavaScript.
Okay.
There are not that many differences in the syntax itself. While, the same. Do, it's the same.
Yep.
For, it's pretty much the same. Now there's one difference, and that is in the for each.
Yes.
So there's not a for each in JavaScript.
Correct.
As far as a core looping construct.
Right.
There is a for each function that works on arrays, and that's a really, really good way to loop. That's the way I do all of my object looping is I have objects in an array, I just for each on them.
Yep.
Okay, so that's what you can see. Oh, that's not what I've done here. I did that in another place right here. On line 4, you can see that I'm calling the for each function, albeit in a little bit goofy way because I'm dealing with a node list there. But I'm using the for each function to loop through a list of arrays. So that's the direct analogy of the for each in C#.
Okay.
Now there is a construct in JavaScript called for-in. Have you used that before?
I have not.
See, if you come from C# to JavaScript, you go,
Which
oh,
I have.
hey, for-in.
Yep.
This is great. This is like for each, right? I'll be able to use this. You try to use it, and it doesn't work quite the same, okay? It doesn't give you an object inside your iteration, inside your block. Instead, it still just gives you an index.
Okay.
So you still then need to use that index to capture the item from the array that you're actually looping.
Okay.
So very, very little, very subtle differences between the two, so we should move on. We have just a little bit of time left to cover functions in JavaScript and C#.
And then classes and inheritance.
Yes, which might take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
It's okay. Okay, functions. Are functions necessary?
No, not at all. Why do you ask?
We could just do everything inside of our
Absolutely.
primary block,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Everything imperatively in one big block. We could.
Can we bring back the go-to as well?
Yeah.
Please?
Yeah, let's go there.
With line numbers.
Jump. Jump till you can't jump no more. Okay, functions, absolutely critical, absolutely critical, and an absolutely elemental part of the language. We need functions for sure. Functions at their root, hopefully you know how these work already, but if you don't, functions are going to receive some values, do something, and optionally return a value as the result of that function. In JavaScript, functions are a major part of the language.
Yep.
And in JavaScript, functions are kind of first-class citizens. We can pass them around as values to a variable, and it feels a bit different than it does in C#. With C#, you still have that flexibility to move functions around, but we have to stay strong typed.
Yeah, you wind up having, in C#, if I want to take a function and pass it off to somewhere else, I can do that, but I need to wrap that up inside of a delegate, that a delegate winds up being a pointer to my function, that in JavaScript I can just take it, here you go, but in C#, I need to actually wrap that up inside of a delegate. Now, fortunately, one of the things that we're going to see as we move on with the rest of today is that the compiler will actually help us out quite a bit there, that a lot of times I can just simply say, here's the function that I want, and behind the scenes, it'll wrap up and put that into a delegate for us. But that's what's happening behind the scenes. So I can't just simply take a function and go, here you go, I got to put it inside of something else.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so let's look at my slides here. I've got a very, very simple function just called sum. It takes A and B, and it returns the sum of those two numbers. Okay?
Yep.
Now, for my first declaration here, for my first block, I have declared this in typical function syntax. Okay? Now, in JavaScript, something happens called hoisting. And the same general thing happens in C#, where it doesn't really matter where in your class block you declare your methods. They're just available for that whole class block, right? Yep. And the same type of thing with JavaScript. If you declare it with the classic function syntax, then that function is available inside of its entire scope. It essentially hoists it to the top of that block and is available to you. And that's with that classic syntax. But let's look at another syntax. Look at this one at the end here. This is an anonymous function. Notice that my sum function has a name, right? Sum. Function, sum. It has the name sum. In this case, however, my function does not have a name. It's just an anonymous function.
Right.
And that's perfectly fine. We're using essentially an alternate syntax for creating a function. And in fact, we're putting it into a variable called sum. And again, this script would not work as it is because I'm overloading the word sum, but I'm putting it into a variable called sum, and I can then use that elsewhere. So if you look at this line that says var f equals sum, should have been down below, but var f equals sum means that I'm going to take that function and put it into a variable called f.
Yep.
And JavaScript, the JavaScript engine knows that, well, sum was a function, and so now f is a function.
Yep.
And so now f can be called just like sum was.
Yep.
Now I can say f, throw in some parentheses, and pass in my variables and get a value. So you have to recognize this distinction between the functions when they're referenced without parentheses and functions when they're referenced with parentheses. When you're referencing them with parentheses, you're executing that function.
Right.
When you reference it without, you're referring to the function like you're passing it around.
Yep. Now, one other little thing that I noticed there is you don't have data types anywhere up there. So when you said A, B, and you returned A plus B, that you didn't have a data type anywhere, that you didn't tell JavaScript, hey, I want you to give me numbers, or I want you to give me strings, or that I'm going to give you back something, that you just simply said, here, go, and you just simply said return, and nowhere on there was there data types.
Yeah, JavaScript relies a lot more on the conventions. You know, I, as the developer, know that this is my intent behind this function, and so whenever I call the sum function, I will be sure to pass in integers.
Right.
That's a different style of programming than the C#, where you're assuming, like maybe you're making a function that's very public-facing, and somebody else is going to be calling it, then they will be told through their compiler, you have to pass me integers. That's the way I work. And there are various ways to do that kind of type checking in JavaScript if that's necessary. If you have a public-facing function, and then you can receive values and throw errors that say, this doesn't work.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on from functions in JavaScript and look at functions in C#.
Absolutely. So if we take a look at C#, the biggest thing that I want you to notice here is the syntax, because a lot of times people look at this and they get a little bit confused, and it really is, you just break it down into just a few little bite-sized chunks. That the first part that I'm going to have right here, that's going to be the accessibility. Who's allowed to call this? So public would mean anybody who had access to this class would be allowed to call it. We've got modifiers, and there's a lot of different modifiers that are available. The one that I've got here is static, simply meaning that we wouldn't have to create an instance of the object. And then this is the biggest difference that I want to highlight right now, is you're going to notice that I have to indicate the return type. This is what I'm going to give back to you. So if I want to give you something back, I have to tell you right up front, this is the data type that I'm going to give you. If I'm not going to give you anything back, I have to tell you that as well. And the keyword that I'm going to use for that is going to be void. Then you're going to notice that I give it the name, and then also I've got my parameters as well. And the big thing again about my parameter is I do need that data type. And like Jeremy was mentioning, you could do this in C#, no data types, no whatever. But in C#, if I pass in a bad data type, if I maybe forget to have a return statement that's going to give you back the data type, it's going to fail. Now, another type of method, and this is really a method when you get right down to it, is a little thing called a property that will allow me to access values like fields. And this is very advantageous because it can help clean up my code. Now, you're going to notice that the syntax is going to be basically the same, the accessibility, a modifier, and then a data type, but then just simply a name. And then what you're going to notice is that I'm going to have a get and a set side, where get would be called whenever you go to actually read the value, and then set is going to be called when you tried to set the value, which is what I've done there at the bottom. Now, the nice part is that I actually get real code here. So if I wanted to do any form of validation, like maybe I wanted to do a data check on email, make sure that it looked like an email address, then I could go ahead and perform that code inside of there. But there's going to be a lot of times when really all that you need is just some place to store some data, especially if you're going to be doing maybe MVVM, model view model, where I'm going to be creating classes that are just there to represent what my data looks like, and I'm really not going to have validation built into there. Or maybe I'm doing it other ways with maybe like attributes. In that type of a scenario, then what I can do is I could actually just type out the code that you see on the right, and when it compiles, it'll compile basically to be the code that you see on the left. So it makes life a lot easier when you're having to go in and just create those simple little properties.
Yeah, much shorter. Look how many lines of code you saved there.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's go in real quick and take a look at, where am I? I want to be back down to, there we go. Let's go in and take a look at how we're going to now create and manage and work with classes.
Actually, do you think that maybe we should save this for, maybe we could be a little bit agile?
Agile?
Agile.
Yep.
Take this part of the module and save it for a later module because we're maybe a little over time.
Let's actually do that. I'm thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a real quick 10-minute break.
Yeah.
And then we'll come on back and we'll take a look at classes and then roll on into things from there.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at lists next.
Yep. Sounds great.
Great.
We'll see you guys back here in 10.
Thanks for joining us.